That Madame Blavatsky was very instrumental in founding this illustrious bookshop. You may also know that on one occasion, Aleister Crowley, who was a regular customer, is said to have made all the books disappear and reappear with a magical spell. I'm very glad to see he's not here tonight. Both Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley have walk-on roles in my new book, which covers the history of the Western engagement with Indian spirituality from the mid-19th century to the 1980s, and as my friend here said, up to the controversial Guru Rajneesh. If I had to describe the book, I suppose I do, I describe it as a journey, an excursion, a magical mystery tour, if you like, through a cast of scholars, seekers, saints, poets, occultists, swamis, and quite a few charlatans. All of them characters in that colourful pageant that has been the West's fascination with Indian spiritual teachings. I'm going to talk about a few of them tonight, but not, you'll be relieved to hear, all of them. For the purposes of the book, this search begins with a chair, and that's to be found a mile or so away from here in Eccleston Square, the headquarters of the British Buddhist Society. The chair is where the great Victorian polymath, Sir Edwin Arnold, was sitting when in 1879 he wrote an epic prose poem, The Light of Asia. That's about the life of the Buddha, the first poetic telling of the life of the Buddha. I should qualify that by saying that only part of the book was written in the chair. Other parts were scribbled on the district line, with Arnold travelling from his home in South Kensington to the offices of the Daily Telegraph in Fleet Street, where he was the paper's editor. I think I'm right saying he's the only newspaper editor that's ever written an epic poetic life of the Buddha, that maybe the editor of The Sun is working on one now. The Light of Asia, it provided a very romantic picture of the Buddha's life. And you can imagine the story of him meditating under the Bodhi tree could almost have been illustrated by pre-Raphaelite painters like Burne-Jones. Extraordinarily, the book went on to sell more than 1 million copies in Britain and America, and was translated into countless languages around the world. I don't have a picture of Sir Edwin to show you. Has anybody here seen a picture of Sir Edwin Arnold? No, nobody has. Well, put in your mind the image of a very distinguished looking man, formally dressed in a frock coat, wing collar and cravat, with a cavalier's beard and a swept-back wings of greying hair. He was a great eminent Victorian. He'd been the principal of a college in Pune, where he developed an interest in Eastern philosophy. He learned Sanskrit, one of the 19 languages that he could eventually speak. And he went on to publish The Light Celestial, a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Mahatma Gandhi was a great fan, and he would credit Arnold with introducing him to his own religion's most sacred text. Another enthusiast was Alan Bennett, a friend of Aleister Crowley's, who read The Light of Asia as a young man and went on to become the first Englishman to become a Buddhist monk in Burma, taking the name Ananda Mataya. I'll come to him a bit later. I'm going to take off my jacket, it's rather warm here. Excuse me. Late Victorian and early Edwardian England was a time of great ferment, questioning of Christian teaching and of new fads and enthusiasms, from natural living and food reform to anti-vivisection and social hygiene, along with the growth of all manner of new groups and societies. Edwin Arnold and Gandhi were both committee members of the London Vegetarian Society. There was the Theosophical Society and the Spiritualist Association. There were free thought groups and a growing interest in Eastern philosophy and spiritual teachings. One of those interesting characters I mentioned was a woman named Annie Besant. She was a Fabian, a feminist and a free thinker who was threatened with prison after publishing a pamphlet on birth control, and who in 1888 helped to organise the strike of the women workers at the Bryant and May matchstick factory in the East End. That was one of the first trade union actions in Britain. It was after reading Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, and then meeting Blavatsky herself, that Besant became a theosophist. When Blavatsky died, she became president of the Theosophical Society and was instrumental in bringing forward Krishnamurti, who arrived in London in 1911. He was promoted as the new messiah of the age. His greatest supporter was Lady Emily Lutyens. Do we know about Lady Emily Lutyens?
The wife of Lutyens, the architect?
The wife of Lutyens, the architect, indeed. Lutyens was the eminent architect of the day, designed the cenotaph, of course. And Emily became obsessed with Krishnamurti, and her devotion to him, as much emotional as spiritual, almost destroyed her marriage. Krishnamurti, of course, rejected the attempts to bring him forward as the world teacher, turning his back on theosophy in 1925, declaring the truth is a pathless land. Another man who sums up this spirit of inquiry is Paul Brunton, who in 1934 published a book, A Search in Secret India. I guess you could call Brunton the first spiritual tourist. I wrote a book of that title, but he got there first. He was born in the East End of London, the son of a bootmaker in 1898, a year after Watkins founded this bookshop. His real name was Hyman Isaacs, but like many sons of Jewish immigrants, he changed his name, firstly to Raphael Hurst, and then to Paul Brunton. He served in the First World War, then became a member of the Theosophical Society and the Spiritualist Association. Moving in Bohemian circles, he opened a bookshop, not this one, and wrote for occult magazines. In 1930, he went to India in search of a guru, and it was there he met Meher Baba. Brunton wasn't much impressed with Meher. He was in search of miracles, and Meher failed to provide him any. Instead, he asked Brunton to go back to the West and spread the word of Meher as the coming world saviour, which Brunton was very reluctant to do. He did, however, devote a couple of chapters in A Search in Secret India to Meher. But by the time that book was published, Meher had already come to the West. If he's known at all now, Meher Baba is probably best known as the guru of Pete Townsend of The Who. And Pete Townsend was partly inspired in writing the pop opera Tommy by Meher Baba, the deaf, dumb and blind boy. Blind, but he had taken a vow of silence, communicating only by spelling out words on an alphabet board. His utterances tended to be necessarily scarce, as you can imagine, although he is credited with coining the adage, "Don't worry, be happy," which later launched a hit record and 1 million badges and bumper stickers. Nonetheless, he seemed to have had a very powerful, almost hypnotic effect on people. Christmas Humphreys, the QC and founder of the British Buddhist Society, met Meher in London and said, quote, "He literally radiated love." Meher had a particularly powerful effect on women, which, as we've seen with Emily Lutyens and Krishnamurti, seemed to be the case with a number of the first Indian gurus and swamis to come to the West. Before that, when Swami Vivekananda spoke at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, he was besieged by women admirers, including Annie Besant, who was there as a representative of the Theosophical Society, and who described him as purposeful, virile and strong, a man among men. There was another devotee of his called Mrs. Roxy Blodgett, fantastic name, and she became a devotee. She put her finger on what Vivekananda's appeal was when she described how the child side of his character was, quote, "a constant appeal to the mother quality in all good women." I think there was something going on that wasn't altogether spiritual with this. I think that what these figures somehow appeared to be, to women of a certain type, certain class perhaps, was a very romantic alternative to the kind of staid Edwardian picture of manhood at that time. These were very romantic figures. So in England and later in America, Mayor Barber gathered around himself a group of devoted followers, upper middle class, wealthy, usually artistic, bohemian, all of them women, whom he called his lovers. And he meant that in a spiritual sense. He was strictly celibate. Contemporary accounts of the day, and these are extraordinary if you read these, describe Mayer's followers simply weeping profusely, simply because he was in their presence. I mean, it's extraordinary to imagine that on meeting him, sophisticated, intelligent people would just burst into tears. This is the effect that it seemed to have on people. When he arrived in America in 1932, the newspapers greeted him with a mixture of bemusement, skepticism, and more than a tinge of racism. The Milwaukee Sentinel, I'm sure we're all devoted readers of the Milwaukee Sentinel, a publication more accustomed to reporting on dairy yields and beer sales, wrote, "The ignorant, simple-minded natives of India are greatly impressed by holy men, and it is expected that the credulous-minded in America will chip in liberally when those who are promoting the holy man pass around the hat. But when it comes to performing miracles, men of science or real intelligence will want it to be shown." Now, despite newspaper reports like this, Mayer actually became a big hit in Hollywood. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, who were the movie colony's most glamorous power couple, threw a grand party for him that all of Hollywood society attended. He was fascinated by films. He particularly loved silent comedies, when he was taken around the studios meeting Gary Cooper, Marlene Dietrich, and Tallulah Bankhead. There's a fantastic picture, actually, I wish I could have got it for the book, which shows Mayer meeting Tallulah Bankhead. And Tallulah Bankhead had a reputation as being sexually voracious. I think we can say that quite candidly. And Mayer is there immaculate in a white suit with long flowing black hair. And he's holding his alphabet board. And Tallulah Bankhead is looking at him. And if eyes could devour, she is devouring Mayer Barber. And he is pointing at the alphabet board. It looks as if he's pointing at the letter N. And I'm guessing he's saying, "No way," but maybe that's not altogether the case was. His connection to Garbo was actually was a fascinating woman named Mercedes D'Acosta. She was a Hollywood screenwriter, a highly exotic figure, a lesbian who'd had affairs with Dietrich, Pola Negri, and numerous others. She claimed that she could take any woman from any man. Again, look at pictures of Mercedes D'Acosta. She really is an exotic-looking figure. She was obsessed with Garbo, and they were lovers for a while. Mercedes was introduced to Mayer at a time when she was in despair over her affair with Garbo, and he became half guru, half relationship counsellor. Mayer was desperate to have a film made about himself, and he wanted Mercedes to write the script. He also wanted her to introduce him to Garbo. I think that was really what he wanted from it. He wanted to meet Greta Garbo at almost any cost. But in the end, that never happened, nor did Mercedes write the script. Disillusioned, she travelled to India, where she became a devotee of another guru, Ramana Maharshi, who I think among all the gurus I talk about in the book, along with Ramakrishna, seems to be the closest to being a genuine saint. What's interesting to me is that Pete Townsend never met or saw Mayer Barber, who died in 1968. Townsend was very much part of the generation who had come to Eastern religion via a familiar route at that time, from the Beats and Jack Kerouac, through Alan Watts, to the Beatles and the Maharishi. I don't think we can underestimate, too, the role that drugs played in turning a generation towards the East. And one of the principal conduits to the drug culture for the Beatles was Timothy Leary, the man who urged the world to turn on, tune in, drop out. When Leary and Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Doors of Perception, first took psychedelics, they equated the experience to a state of enlightenment or satori, described in Eastern spiritual texts, and their books in turn became guidebooks for the drug culture. John Lennon was inspired to write Tomorrow Never Knows on the Revolver album by reading Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert's book, The Psychedelic Experience, which was based in turn on an ancient funerary text that became known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That book was based on manuscripts that had been acquired by a British army officer in Tibet in 1919, who then passed them on to an American anthropologist, Walter Evans Wentz, in Darjeeling. I think it's very interesting, this kind of traffic in ancient wisdom and the way these things emerge and are passed around from one thing to the other, and of course become something completely different. I'm sure whoever, the Bard, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but the Bardas, somebody will help me to pronounce the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Sorry? Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sure whomever wrote that, and it's probably written by a number of people, would never have imagined that it would be a guidebook for Timothy Leary or for drug experiences for that matter. Richard Alpert, like Paul Brunton before him, he went to India in search of a guru and became one himself, taking the name Ram Dass and writing a book, Be Here Now, which became one of the great counterculture books of the era. Leary too became a guru, but of a slightly different sort. I'm going to just read a little bit here that I hope gives you a flavour of who Timothy Leary was and how he viewed Indian spirituality through a psychedelic lens. In the spring of 1962, Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist who had recently begun conducting experiments with the psychedelic drugs psilocybin and LSD, visited a Ramakrishna ashram in Boston, run by a former Air Force major turned Vedanta Hindu monk named Fred Swain. Leary, a rambunctious Irish-American whose colourful CV included being court-martialed during his time as a cadet at West Point Military Academy, had been introduced to magic mushrooms while on a trip to Mexico in 1960. Fred Swain had also ingested magic mushrooms in Mexico with the anthropologist Gordon Wasson, and after taking LSD with Leary at his home, Swain invited Leary to visit his ashram with a view to leading some of his students through an LSD session. On the anointed day, Leary arrived at the ashram. In a mood of sacramental reverence, LSD was placed in chalices on an altar adorned with incense and flowers. The LSD was then mixed with holy water from the Ganges, blessed and drunk. As the drug took hold, the group moved to the shrine room, sitting Indian style on cushions, chanting Hindu mantras, the pungent aroma of incense perfuming the air. Swain had already acquainted Leary with the teachings of Ramakrishna and what Leary would describe as the psychedelic pantheon of gods in Hinduism. Now, as the holy folk got high, the shrine room began to take on the aspect of a living Purana, or Hindu mythological text. Leary felt himself transforming into the god Shiva. A Vedanta nun crawled into his lap, whom Leary, naturally, saw as Shiva's consort, Shakti. The incense smoke rose, Leary wrote, essence of holy India, reek of Kaligat Temple, Calcutta, holy scent of Ram Mandir, Benares and Jagannath Puri and Konarak. Ramakrishna's statue breathed and his eyes twinkled the message. Vivekananda's brown face beamed and winked. Christ grinned to be joined again by his celestial brothers. The rare wood walls breathed. The sacred Kundalini serpent uncoiled up the bronzed candelabra to the 1,000-petaled lotus blossom. This was the fulcrum moment of eternity, the exact second of consciousness, fragile, omniscient. God was present and spoke to us in silence. I'm not sure if anyone ever accused Leary of writing in purple prose, but it certainly has an effect. Leary maintained that he was a Hindu from that moment on. No, that's not the way to say it. I recognized that day in the temple that we are all Hindus in our essence. We are all Hindu gods and goddesses, laughing Krishna, immutable Brahma, yes, and Asiatic sensual Shiva. Stern Kali with bloody hands, undulant flowering Lakshmi, multi-armed Vishnu, noble Rama. That day in the temple I discovered my Hindu-ness. For Timothy Leary, that slow, invisible process of becoming a guru, a holy man, as he put it, had begun. There's a postscript to John Lennon that I'd like to conclude with. The cover of the Beatles' most famous album, Sgt. Pepper, features a collage of different characters chosen by the Beatles themselves. The 2 or 3 Indian gurus that are on the cover were naturally the choice of George Harrison. Among John Lennon's choices was Aleister Crowley. Crowley was a notorious figure, as I'm sure many of you know, in the 1920s and 30s, described by the tabloid press of the day as the wickedest man in the world, with lurid stories of sex magic and animal sacrifice. Although in his defence, his friend Gerald York wrote that Crowley, I quote, only sacrificed a few sparrows, 2 pigeons, a cat, a goat, and a toad. And of these, the cat and goat were extemporized by request. I'd like to reassure you all that no cats, goats or toads were sacrificed in the writing of this book. There's an irony, perhaps, that the person, the wickedest man in the world, most admired, whom everyone who met him regarded as the most noble. And in a way, I think their friendship is, to me, much more interesting than Crowley himself. The friend was a man named Alan Bennett, and Crowley met Bennett in 1898, when both were members of the occult group, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, where Bennett, although he was only 24 or 25 at the time, was recognised as an expert practitioner of ritual magic. They became friends, and Crowley, who lived off a generous family inheritance, supported Bennett for a while. Throughout his life, Bennett was plagued by illness, in particular asthma, as well as poverty. And in 1900, Crowley borrowed money from his mistress, which of course he never paid back, to pay for Bennett to sail to Ceylon, where the climate was more healthy. It was there that Bennett dived deeper into his interest in Buddhism. Begun, if you remember, reading Sir Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia. There's a tremendous circularity about all of these stories. It's like a daisy chain. Everybody is connected. Everybody passes on the message to the next person. So it was there that Bennett dived deeper into his interest in Buddhism, and that eventually led to a separation of the paths with Crowley. Crowley pursued his occult interests, founding his own religion, Thelema. But Bennett was, and I quote, done with magic, as Crowley called it. Bennett wrote, no Buddhist will consider it worthwhile to pass from the crystalline clearness of his own religion to this involved obscurity. Acquiring worldly powers, he wrote, was a pointless and futile pursuit. The greatest miracle was the miracle of the power of truth to conquer falsehood. Even when the truth is hard to bear, when the falsehood appeals to every hope and passion in our hearts. From Ceylon, Bennett travelled to Burma, which is where he was ordained as a Buddhist monk. In 1908, he returned briefly to England to spread the Buddhist teachings, being put up in a house in Barnes and giving talks at various meetings around London, including at the Battersea Town Hall, where he spoke to a reported audience of almost 1,000 people. He returned to Burma, but by now his health was worsening. A visitor described how he could barely walk across the room without bringing on an asthma attack, and his skin was yellow as a Burman's with jaundice. In 1916, he returned to London, poor and ailing, living firstly in a hostel for the poor, and then in a small, dingy, rented room in Eccles Road, Battersea. He continued to edit a magazine, the Buddhist Review. His assistant was the young Raphael Hurst, who later became Paul Brunton, of course. Bennett died on the 9th of March 1923 at the age of 51, with a member of the Buddhist Society at his bedside. It was recorded that his dying wish was to give his last few pence to a beggar he heard passing beneath his window. He was buried in Morden Cemetery in South London. This white Buddhist, as Paul Brunton would later write, whose ship has sailed for the infinite waters of Nirvana. There was no memorial stone placed at his grave. Thank you very much. I was very intrigued by Mayor Barber. He's an extraordinary character in all sorts of ways, and I'm still not sure what to make of him, actually. Maybe somebody here could fully enlighten me what to make of Mayor Barber. But one of the things that he was particularly interested in, or was associated with, was that he devoted a great deal of his time to seeking out and caring for masts, M-A-S-T-S. Masts were people whom other people would regard as mad, insane, crazy, but whom Mayor Barber regarded as God intoxicated and take care of them and look after them. And I'd like to read about one particular mast called Karim. There's an extraordinary story of one such mast named Karim Barber, to whom Mayor Barber devoted his attentions for a number of weeks in 1940. Mayor had first encountered Karim in Calcutta, sitting on a pavement against a wall. He was clad in filthy rags, with skeins of steel wire around his neck, his hair and beard thick, dirty and matted, but with eyes that shone like burnished swords. He was said to have sat at that same spot for 6 years. Sometime later, Mayor dispatched a disciple, known as Kaka, to Calcutta to bring Karim to his ashram at Ranchi, where Mayor was staying. Kaka found the master seated at his customary spot, but when Kaka asked him to come with him, Karim simply laughed. Kaka went to buy a tunic and loincloth and returned to the spot, where he enlisted the help of 2 interested Muslims and hailed a Victoria cab. When he invited Karim to exchange his rags for clothes, the mast rose without a word and allowed himself to be dressed in the street. By this time a small crowd had gathered, for Karim, we are told, was locally venerated as a holy man. Kaka feared a disturbance, but the mast allowed himself to be led to the cab and carried to the railway station. There Kaka found a third-class compartment and installed his prize. As the train was leaving, Karim spoke for the first time, saying, "The ticket is taken and the train has started." But he soon became restless, putting one leg out of the window and saying nothing. Kaka assumed he wished to visit the toilet. This was the case, and when the master had relieved himself, he picked out 3 or 4 coins of 1 or 2 annas and an odd copper piece from his ordure, washed them thoroughly under the tap, tossed them in his mouth and swallowed them. It later became apparent that this was a regular practice of his. At Ranchi, the master was lodged in a special room, where Mayor Barber would go several times a day to feed him and sit alone with him. The master was usually silent, but from time to time would utter some short phrase with the sudden vigour of a lid blowing off a boiling kettle. Sometimes, as Mayor sat with him, Karim would laugh and sing, and sometimes he could be heard in the dead of night singing to himself. A few weeks later, Mayor returned to his main ashram, Meherabad, taking Karim with him. The mast was installed in a special hut with a bamboo lattice screen. After 2 weeks, Mayor announced that his work with Karim was over, and Kaka was instructed to return him to his pavement in Calcutta. There was a dispensary nearby, and the doctor undertook to feed Karim regularly, sufficient money being left for the purpose. Mayor Barber would visit Calcutta on several occasions after that, but he did not see Karim again. Make of all that what you will. Very happy to answer any questions.
I wasn't aware of the tensions between Lutyens and his wife via Krishnamurti, but Lutyens built the British Medical Society on Tavistock Place.
Right.
And originally that was going to be the Theosophical Society's centre.
Yeah.
So there must have been some goodwill there somehow. There was internal divisions in the Theosophical Society, membership changed. Basically, nobody was holding enough folding. And, it's now that lovely building. It's the British Medical Society. It's a strange building. I've been inside it. It's got slightly It doesn't look medical. It's got a strange.
Does it look more theosophical than medical?
Yeah, it's just got nice round edges, and it's out of date for when it's built in the 20s. It's got this sort of strange. It's got a lovely little garden.
Right.
So something positive come out of it.
Right.
Lutchin's built.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, I think he was probably strong-armed into designing that rather by his wife. But I mean, what happened was that Krishnamurti would travel quite a bit. He came here. Emily Lutchins was there at the station waiting to greet him, with great sort of excitement and expectation, because she was already quite active in the Theosophical Society by then. Yeah, she became, I think, completely infatuated by him. And she admits as much in her autobiography. She doesn't use the word infatuation, but certainly that's the impression given. And he would travel quite a lot, and she would leave her family behind to follow him and be with him. And I think Edwin got rather tired of this, not simply because he was picking up the bill.
He was the preeminent architect of his time. So
Absolutely.
If you see the place in Delhi, if you see the law centre, that huge area.
He designed New Delhi, capital of British India at that time, yeah. Hello.
The first ascended master was written by Voltaire,
Okay.
Saint-Germain. Yeah. And the idea was how to de-Christianize the West,
Right.
because they wanted to de-exclusivize the resurrected Christ by creating a busload of resurrected masters. Master DK, Master PJ. They just came up, as Blavatsky was smoking hashish, he came up with new masters.
Right.
But behind all this, Voltaire was a Freemasonic Le Neuf Sir lodge. Blavatsky was a 33-degree Masonic lodge. Annie Besant parades herself in a Masonic regalia very proudly. Krishnamurti was funded by the Order of the Star, which is a Masonic lodge. And if you just go across to Covent Garden, you see the £100 million temple with Zeus and Allah and Lucifer, they're one of their favorite gods. So the question is that these movements were funded, including the OTO, Crowley meeting Aldous Huxley, giving him peyote to create this 60s movement. This is all masterminded, funded, with a purpose behind this. So, there's an elephant in the room.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the Ascended Masters as you do, but certainly the Order of the Golden Dawn was founded by people in a Masonic lodge. So, I mean, there was a very clear, very clear relationship there.
The magazine of the Masonic Lodge was called The New Age.
Okay.
That's
Very,
what it was called.
very prescient. Yeah. Thank you.
Other?
Yeah, there's a gentleman here.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My question is on the topic of controversial gurus.
Okay.
So 20 years ago, you published a book called The Dance of 17 Lives,
Yes.
which is about a Tibetan guru called Karmapa.
Yes.
Which I found, in my opinion, rather fawning account of this guru.
Okay.
Now, in light of a recent Canadian court case, which you may have heard of, in which the Karmapa agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement with a woman who'd accused him, alleged that he had sexually assaulted and impregnated her, something, by the way, which he never publicly denied. Have you revised your opinion on the Karmapa?
I think that's. I mean, I'm aware of that case. I can only judge people as I find them, really. And I met the Karmapa on several occasions. Met many people around him. I think that controversy is so. I mean, the controversy around the Karmapa is so complex. No, I don't think I've revised my opinion of him, because I'm not altogether sure how much I trust the accounts that have been published of that. I mean, the counter argument is that woman was a plant, basically, by the Chinese in order to discredit the Karmapa. So, I can't really comment on that. I mean, I think it goes to a wider question, doesn't it, really, about what you might call Shangri-La syndrome, and that I think is something which is characterises so much of the West's engagement with gurus over probably since the time that I, going back to the very first moment that I mentioned in the book. I've written about, I mean, I'm disappointed you found it fawning. It's supposed to be just objective. I'm a journalist, I'm not a devotee, I'm not a Buddhist. But I've written fairly extensively about scandals with gurus. I've written extensively about Sai Baba, scandals surrounding Sai Baba. I've written extensively about the scandals surrounding Sogyal Rinpoche. Written 2 very, very long pieces in the Telegraph magazine about that. I think I was the first person in Britain to write about that. So I definitely don't have a fawning attitude to any kind of teachers or leaders or whatever. And I think it is a very complex and controversial subject. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Probably the difference between charlatans and
Swans.
yeah, the sort of genuine.
Yeah.
If you were to pick out 1 or 2 that you really think, yes, ultimate truth and ability to communicate that, who would you recommend from all your...
Oh God, I'm not in the business of recommending teachers, I'm afraid. That's way beyond my pay grade. I think
or just your own sense.
Yeah, I mean, the people that I think I emerged from my researches with the greatest respect for in the context of this book, Swami Vivekananda, who I didn't know a great deal about, but was very interested to read a lot more about, and Ramana Maharshi. And the person who, and this might upset some people, but the person I think was probably closest to a charlatan was Rajneesh, who is obviously a very controversial figure. One of the things that interests me about Rajneesh is, as you may know, may not know, after he fled from America under investigation for tax fraud and immigration fraud and all manner of things, taking his gold watches with him, but having to leave the 92 Rolls Royces behind, he then went to India and miraculously his name changed to Osho. And if you now look at all the books that are coming out of the Osho organization, there's no mention of 92 Rolls Royces or gold watches. I think I should qualify that by saying I do think he was a brilliant man. I think he was a brilliant man. And I think that he was, as a teacher, the time was absolutely, when I say right, I don't mean that as a judgment, but the time was kind of perfect for him to emerge at the time he did. You may know that in India, he started as a philosopher, and when he sort of morphed into a guru, he was known as the free sex guru because part of his message, part of his teaching, was about liberation, about liberating ourselves from the constraints of society, from all the conventions of society. I'm simplifying horribly, but you get the point. And I think his appeal probably to a lot of people at that time was coming, as he did in the 70s through the 80s, in the wake of the hippie movement, with a creed of sort of a sexual liberation. I think that gelled perfectly with Rajneesh, I should say. And also what was happening with the human potential movement in California at that time, at Essel and group therapy and all those kinds of things. So he's a fascinating, don't get me wrong, he's a fascinating character. Perhaps he's not a charlatan, perhaps I'm being unkind in calling him a charlatan. But I think he was, and this is something that I think often happens, I think he was corrupted by his following. And I think that happens with gurus. And I think you could say the worst thing for a guru is to have a following. But then that's a paradox.
I wondered what your own relationship with Shangri-La syndrome is or was. Has that changed?
Yeah, I mean, my interest in all this began, when I was late teenage years, reading Jack Kerouac and reading Alan Watts and, the Beatles, the Maharishi, that turned my attention to the East. I didn't actually go to India at that time. I wasn't in the VW combi van that our friend mentioned at the beginning. I went to America. But, and I suppose I might have had a slightly kind of starry-eyed view of that. But I'm not, I have to say, I'm not a joiner of anything, really. A very good friend of mine went off and became a devotee of Sai Baba, and continues to be a devotee of Sai Baba, despite everything that's revealed as Sai Baba. I think that's interesting, that people who, and this happens very often, doesn't it, that when gurus are revealed to have feet of clay rather than feet of gold, some followers have so much invested in them that they can't possibly accept the truth. And I think that's true of Soga Rinpoche. You know, there are still people who would say that Soga Rinpoche was, and he was an interesting teacher, but he wasn't an exemplar of ethics and morality, you know. But there are people who will deny that, who will cling to the belief because it's so important to their own self-esteem.
I mean, that's happening with Dr. Bhagwan right now, because
Is it?
my partner is, you know, my partner's 80 and he was a big part of that whole
I'd be interested to hear about that.
I'm a journalist, and
Okay.
I always was sceptical about him, about Bhagwan, and we used to argue about it. So he has only recently come around, because there've been, you know, there was a big article in the Sunday Times about the sexual abuse in the commune. I mean, it started with Wild Wild Country, but it's come
Yeah, which is a great film. Yeah.
really great. I mean, and actually it was the generation of my son that introduced me to that. They were the ones that watched that and told us about it. You know. Anyway, but exactly the same thing that you're talking about is happening within that community. So
Okay.
some people refuse to look at anything that went on, and others, like my partner, has had to really look at himself,
Yeah.
and look at what happened, you know. And actually, I've seen him grow through that.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
I really have.
I think one of the interesting things about Rajneesh was before he went to Oregon, when the first ashram in Pune, and as I just mentioned, there was this sort of interesting collision between his teachings and what was happening at Esalen, and the group therapy sessions that were happening at Esalen. And a lot of kind of teachers from Esalen went to Pune and became devotees of Rajneesh and started adopting Swami, calling themselves Swami Tata. A guy called Paul Lowe was one. And the group therapy sessions that have been going on in California at Esalen were sort of, the brakes were taken off at Pune. And so while some of the confrontations at Esalen would have been quite sort of aggressive and people speaking their mind and you know, catharsis, at Pune they became, some of them just like kind of uninhibited sex sessions, and then violent, people having their arms and legs broken and bruises, so much so that the local hospital in Pune, when people were taken in there, they had a sort of euphemism for it, fell off a ladder at Rajneesh ashram, you know, and they couldn't admit broke their leg because somebody was so outright aggressive. So I mean, I think he took the lid off people's emotions in some ways that may have been therapeutic and cathartic, but in other ways that were pretty unsavoury and dangerous, I think.
I mean, it has led to a lot of the work that is around personal development work. That has,
Sure.
You know, that has evolved, developed, boundaries a bit. I mean, all the kind of 40-year-olds now are all putting in have put in loads of boundaries around all of that stuff and made it safe. So it didn't come from all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, interesting, a very interesting sort of moment, really. Thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you.